The cold in northern Minnesota had a way of finding bone, and Samuel Okonkwo felt it in the place where his left arm used to be. He stood in the parking lot of the Hanson's Foods grocery store, 3 plastic bags at his feet, trying to figure out the geometry of getting them to his truck. The phantom pain was bad today, a burning ache in fingers that no longer existed, and his prosthetic sat on the passenger seat where he'd left it, because some days the weight of it was more than he could carry. The bags weren't heavy. Canned soup, bread, peanut butter, the cheap coffee that tasted like regret. A week's worth of survival for a man living on disability checks and whatever hours the library could give him. But 3 bags meant 3 trips, and 3 trips meant 3 chances for his knee to buckle on the ice, and one fall in this parking lot could mean a shattered hip and the end of whatever independence he had left. Sam bent down and tried to loop 2 bags over his right wrist. The plastic cut into his skin. He grabbed the third with his fingers and straightened up, feeling the strain in his shoulder, the familiar protest of a body asked to do the work of 2 arms with 1. He made it 4 steps before the first bag slipped. Cans rolled across the asphalt, tomato soup, green beans, chicken broth, spinning toward the wheel of a massive black motorcycle parked 2 spaces over. Sam swore under his breath and went after them, his knee screaming, his balance precarious on the salt-crusted ice. A boot stopped the tomato soup can. Black leather, silver buckle, attached to a woman who looked like she could arm wrestle a bear and win. She was maybe late 50s, built solid, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a braid, and a leather cut that read, North Star Valkyries across the shoulders. The patches told a story Sam could read. President, Desert Storm veteran, 15 years of service. A knitted scarf, handmade and worn soft, was wrapped twice around her neck against the cold. You need a hand? She asked, then caught herself. Her eyes had found the empty sleeve pinned at his elbow. Sorry, poor choice of words. It's fine. Sam reached for the can, but she was already picking it up, gathering the others, moving with the efficient grace of someone used to solving problems. I've got it. I can see that. She straightened and looked at him, not with pity, which he'd learned to recognize and hate, but with something closer to assessment. Army? How'd you know? The way you're standing. The way you said, I've got it, like you'd rather chew glass than accept help. She held out the cans. I was Army too. Nurse Corps. 4 years in field hospitals watching boys pretend they weren't bleeding out because asking for a medic felt like weakness. Sam took the cans and shoved them back in the bag. That's not... Sure it is. She picked up the bag he'd dropped, then grabbed another one before he could protest. You're parked over here? I can carry my own groceries. Never said you couldn't, but it's 12 degrees, you're about to bust your ass on this ice, and I've got 2 working arms and nowhere to be. She started walking toward his truck, an old F-150 with rust spreading along the wheel wells like a disease. You coming? Sam stood there for a moment, pride and pragmatism at war in his chest. The phantom pain flared, a sharp reminder that his body had already lost enough battles. He followed her. She loaded the bags into the truck bed while he fumbled with his keys, and when he finally got the door open, she was leaning against the tailgate like she had all day. I'm Greta, she said. People call me Mother. Sam. You live around here, Sam? Cedar Street, the blue house with the caved-in porch. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or concern. The Vance property? You know it? I know the landlord. Her tone suggested that wasn't a compliment. How long you been there? 18 months. Furnace still work? Sam hesitated. The furnace had died in November. He'd been running space heaters ever since, the electric bill eating what little savings he had, waiting for repairs that never came. It's fine. Uh-huh. Greta pushed off the tailgate and pulled a receipt from her pocket. Her own grocery receipt, he realized, and a pen from her cut. She scribbled something and handed it to him. That's my number. You need anything, you call. I don't need... Didn't say you did, said if you do. She met his eyes, and there was no judgment there, just the steady certainty of someone who'd seen too much to bother with pretense. I run a support group at the VA on Thursdays. Grief mostly, but we get all kinds. You ever want to stop by? We meet at 7. I'm not... Sam stopped. He'd been about to say, I'm not grieving, but that wasn't true. He was grieving the arm, the marriage, the career, the man he used to be. He was grieving the 6 men from his unit who came home in boxes while he came home in pieces. He was grieving every morning he woke up and couldn't remember what day it was until he checked his journal. "You're not what?" Greta asked. "Nothing." He pocketed the receipt. "Thanks for the help." Wasn't help, just efficiency. She walked back toward her bike, then turned. "That porch of yours is a liability. County inspector would shut that place down if anyone bothered to report it. Might be worth knowing." She swung onto the motorcycle, kicked it to life, and pulled out of the lot without looking back. Sam sat in his truck for a long time, engine running, heat blasting against the Minnesota cold. The receipt was in his pocket, her number scrawled in blue ink. On the back, above the grocery total, was an itemized list: milk, eggs, bread, soup, the ordinary things that kept a life going. He pulled out the journal he kept in the glove compartment, spiral bound, pages soft with use, and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Below it, he wrote, "Met Greta, Valkyrie's MC. Thursday meetings at VA, 7 p.m. Phone number on Hansen's receipt." He'd started keeping the journal 2 years ago, when the gaps in his memory had gotten bad enough to scare him. The TBI specialist at the VA had suggested it, and Sam had resisted for months before finally giving in. Now it was his lifeline, a record of things his brain couldn't hold, a paper trail of his own existence. He read back through the last few entries. Rent due, January 15th, 2 weeks overdue now, the 3rd month in a row. Eviction notice on the door last Tuesday. Hearing scheduled for February 3rd. Library shift tomorrow, 10 to 4. And before that, in handwriting he didn't remember writing, called the VA about furnace. They said call the landlord. Landlord didn't answer. Space heater in bedroom. Kitchen too cold to use. The phantom pain pulsed. Sam closed the journal and put the truck in gear. The drive home took 12 minutes through streets glazed with ice and silence. Cedar Street was the kind of block that had given up. Houses with plastic sheeting over broken windows, yards full of snow-buried junk, the skeletal remains of a community that had bled out when the mill closed 15 years ago. Sam's rental was the blue house at the end, listing slightly to the left, its front porch sagging like a broken promise. He parked in the driveway and carried his groceries inside one bag at a time, pride be damned. The kitchen was cold enough that he could see his breath. The space heater in the living room glowed orange, fighting a losing battle against the draft from the windows. On the counter, next to a stack of unopened bills, was the eviction notice. Notice to quit. Non-payment of rent. Sam stared at it, the words blurring slightly at the edges. He'd read it a dozen times since it arrived. He knew what it said, but sometimes his brain lost things, words, numbers, the thread of a conversation, and he had to read them again to make sure they were still there. 2 months behind, $1,200 he didn't have, hearing in 16 days. He thought about Greta's number in his pocket. You need anything you call. He thought about the VA support group, Thursdays at 7. He thought about the porch, sagging and splintered, and her parting words, "County inspector would shut that place down if anyone bothered to report it." Sam put the groceries away, moving slowly in the cold, his arm aching, his head starting to throb with the familiar warning signs of an oncoming migraine. Then he sat down at the kitchen table with his journal and wrote, "February 3rd, eviction hearing. Need $1,200 or proof of habitability issues. Greta mentioned county inspector, look into code violations." Below that, smaller, "TBI bad today. Phantom pain 7:10. Migraine coming. Take meds. Rest." And below that, in letters he pressed hard into the page, "Don't forget." He closed the journal, swallowed 2 pills with cold water from the tap, and went to lie down, in the one room where the space heater kept the cold at bay. Outside, the Minnesota winter settled in. Somewhere across town, a motorcycle engine faded into silence. And in a blue house at the end of Cedar Street, a man who'd learned to survive alone tried to remember why he'd stopped asking for help. The answer was somewhere in his head, buried under scar tissue and shrapnel fragments. But the journal couldn't hold everything. Some things Sam would have to find again on his own. Hank Vance sat in his office above the hardware store and stared at the spreadsheet on his laptop, the numbers blurring together like they always did after the 3rd beer. 12 properties, 12 mortgages, 12 sets of tenants who couldn't pay, or wouldn't pay, or paid late, and expected him to be grateful. His father had built this little empire over 40 years, and Hank had watched it crumble in less than 10. The mill closing had started it. The recession had accelerated it. Now he was robbing Peter to pay Paul, shuffling money between accounts, making promises to the bank he couldn't keep. The blue house on Cedar Street was the worst of them. He'd inherited it from his father, along with a list of repairs that never got done. The furnace, the porch, the water heater, the windows that let in more cold than they kept out. Every month, the tenant called about something else. Every month, Hank told himself he'd get to it. And every month, the money wasn't there. Now the tenant was 2 months behind, and Hank needed that $1,200 more than he needed a conscience. He pulled up the eviction filing on his screen and stared at the name. Samuel Okonkwo. Disabled veteran, according to the application, lost an arm overseas. Hank had thought about that, sometimes, late at night, when the beer made him honest. He'd thought about what it meant to take a house from a man who'd given a limb for his country. But thinking didn't pay the mortgage. Thinking didn't keep the bank from calling. Thinking didn't stop his wife from looking at him like he was a stranger every time another bill came due. Hank finished his beer and closed the laptop. The hearing was in 2 weeks. After that, it was out of his hands. That's what he told himself anyway. The next morning, Sam woke to silence and a headache that felt like someone had driven a railroad spike through his temple. He checked his journal before he checked anything else, a habit now, automatic as breathing. The last entry stared back at him. Don't forget. Forget what? He read backwards. Eviction hearing February 3rd. Code violations, Greta. The grocery store parking lot. The woman with the knitted scarf who'd picked up his cans and looked at him like he was a person instead of a problem. The receipt was still in his coat pocket. He smoothed it out on the kitchen table and stared at the phone number, then at the date scrawled beneath it. Thursday. Today was Thursday. He could go. The VA was only 20 minutes away, and the support group met at 7. He could walk in, sit down, listen to other people talk about their damage. He could pretend he was fine while everyone else pretended they were fine, and maybe that collective pretending would add up to something like progress, or he could stay home and figure this out himself, the way he'd figured out everything else since the IED took his arm and his squad and most of his memory of what happened after. Sam chose option 3. He went to the county assessor's office. The building was downtown, a squat brick structure with handicapped parking that was full and regular parking that required a 3-block walk. Sam made the walk because he'd learned that complaining about inaccessible parking was a luxury for people with energy to spare. By the time he reached the front door, his knee was screaming and his stump was throbbing, and he'd forgotten why he'd come. He pulled out his journal and read, Code violations, county inspector. Right. The clerk at the front desk was a young woman with tired eyes and a nameplate that read, Deborah. She looked up when Sam approached and waited. I need to report a housing code violation, Sam said, or find out how to report one for my rental. You're the tenant? Yes. And you want to report your own landlord? The furnace hasn't worked since November. The porch is collapsing. The windows don't seal. Sam heard himself talking and wondered if he was making sense. Sometimes the words came out wrong. Scrambled, reversed, missing pieces. The TBI had taken his ability to trust his own tongue. Deborah studied him for a moment, something softening in her expression. You'll need to fill out a complaint form. There's a 45-day inspection window, and if violations are found, the landlord has 30 days to remediate before fines kick in. 45 days? Minimum. Could be longer. We're backed up. Sam did the math. The eviction hearing was in 14 days. 45 days might as well be 45 years. Is there any way to expedite it? I've got a hearing coming up. If I could prove the place is uninhabitable, you'd need to request an emergency inspection. That requires documented evidence of immediate health or safety hazards. Deborah slid a form across the counter. Photographs, written complaints, medical records showing harm caused by the conditions. It's a high bar. Sam took the form. His right hand was shaking. Fatigue, cold, the steady erosion of a body that had given everything it had. Thank you. He filled out the form in the lobby, writing slowly, checking each line twice. The TBI made paperwork treacherous. He'd learned that the hard way, signing things he didn't understand, missing deadlines he didn't remember. When he finished, he handed it to Deborah and walked back to his truck through the bitter cold. The drive home took longer than it should have. He missed a turn, ended up on a street he didn't recognize, had to pull over and check his phones, GPS to find his way back. By the time he reached Cedar Street, the afternoon light was fading, and his head was pounding, and he'd forgotten to eat anything since the coffee that morning. Inside, the house was cold, colder than it should have been. Sam walked to the living room and found the space heater dark and silent. He checked the outlet, checked the cord, checked the power strip. Everything was plugged in. Everything was dead. He tried the light switch. Nothing. The power was out. Sam stood in the growing dark, his breath fogging in the air, and felt something give way in his chest. Not despair, exactly. Something quieter. The slow, grinding exhaustion of fighting battles that couldn't be won. He could call the power company. He could dig through his paperwork and find the account number and navigate the automated system and explain that he'd paid the bill. He was sure he'd paid the bill, except he couldn't actually remember paying the bill, and his bank account was down to $47, and maybe he hadn't paid it after all. Or he could sit down in the dark and wait for something to change. He chose neither. He put on his coat, grabbed his keys, and drove to the VA. The support group met in a basement room with fluorescent lights and metal folding chairs arranged in a circle. 12 people sat in those chairs when Sam walked in. Men and women of various ages, various damage, various stages of pretending they were fine. Greta was at the far end, a cup of coffee in her hands, and when she saw him, she nodded once. No surprise, no fanfare, just acknowledgement. Sam took an empty chair near the door and listened. The stories came out in fragments. A man named Ray talked about his wife leaving, his voice flat and practiced. A woman named Christine described the nightmares that wouldn't stop, the medication that made her feel like a ghost. A young guy with burns on his neck and hands said nothing at all, just sat with his eyes on the floor, present but absent. When the circle came around to Sam, he shook his head. "I'm just listening tonight." "That's fine," Greta said. "Listening counts." After the meeting, she found him in the parking lot, struggling to unlock his truck with fingers numbed by cold. "Power's out at your place," she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you—" "Because it's 12 degrees and you showed up here instead of staying home where it's warm, which means it's not warm." She pulled out her phone. "I've got a friend with a generator. We can have it at your place in an hour." "I don't need—" "Sam." Her voice was firm but not unkind. "You're about to lose your house. You're living without heat in the middle of a Minnesota winter, and you just spent 2 hours in a room full of people who understand exactly how hard it is to ask for help." She held up the phone. "Let me make the call." The word stuck in his throat. Yes. Such a small word. Such an impossible wait. "The eviction hearing's in 2 weeks," he said instead. "I went to the county today. Filed a complaint about the code violations, but the inspection could take 45 days. It won't help." "Maybe not through official channels." Greta pocketed her phone and leaned against his truck, arms crossed against the cold. "But I know some people. Contractors, inspectors, a lawyer who handles tenant rights cases. We could build a file, photographs, documentation, expert opinions, present it at the hearing ourselves." "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "I know enough." She met his eyes in the dim light of the parking lot. "I know you carried your groceries one bag at a time because you wouldn't ask a stranger for help. I know you've been fighting alone for so long you've forgotten there's another way. And I know that the man who loses that house won't just be losing a roof, he'll be losing the last piece of ground he's got left." Sam said nothing. The cold seeped through his coat, into his bones, into the empty space where his arm used to be. "Thursday meetings are just the beginning," Greta said. "The Valkyries look out for our own. And like it or not, Sam, you're one of us now." She pushed off the truck and walked toward her bike, pausing at the edge of the light. "I'll have that generator at your place by 9. And Saturday morning, we're coming to take pictures. You can fight us on it, or you can let us help." She smiled, just slightly. "Your choice. But I'd think carefully about which battle's worth winning." She rode off into the dark, leaving Sam alone with the cold and the silence and a decision that felt heavier than any he'd made since the day he woke up in a hospital bed and learned what the IED had taken. He sat in his truck for a long time, engine running, heat blasting. Then he pulled out his journal and wrote, "Thursday, Went to VA meeting. Greta offering help. Generator coming tonight. Saturday. Pictures of house. Below that, in smaller letters, let them help. He underlined it twice so he wouldn't forget. Saturday morning came in gray and bitter, and the Valkyries arrived with it. Sam counted 7 motorcycles pulling into Cedar Street, their engines cutting through the silence like thunder. He watched from the window as they dismounted, women in leather cuts, breath fogging in the cold, moving with the coordinated purpose of people who'd done this before. Greta led the way to his front door. Behind her came a woman with a professional camera, another with a clipboard and measuring tape, and a man in his 60s who walked with the careful precision of someone who'd spent his life looking at buildings. "Sam, this is Eddie Kowalski," Greta said, gesturing to the older man. "Retired building inspector. 32 years with the county. He's going to walk through the house and tell us exactly what we're dealing with." Eddie extended his hand. "Heard about your situation. Mind if I take a look?" Sam stepped aside and let them in. The next 2 hours were a catalog of failure. Eddie moved through the house with a flashlight and a notebook, his expression growing grimmer with each room. The furnace, a 30-year-old unit with a cracked heat exchanger leaking carbon monoxide. The porch, structural supports rotted through, a collapse waiting to happen. The windows, single pane, unsealed, ice forming on the inside of the glass. The water heater, no pressure relief valve, a potential explosion risk. The electrical panel, outdated wiring, scorch marks around 2 of the breakers. "This place should have been condemned years ago," Eddie said when he finished. "I count 11 code violations, 4 of them immediate safety hazards. If I were still on the job, I'd have red-tagged this house on the spot." The woman with the camera, her name was June, Sam had learned, had taken over 200 photographs. The woman with the clipboard, Marlene, had documented everything in triplicate. "We can present this at the hearing," Greta said. "Show the judge that Vance has been collecting rent on an uninhabitable property. That changes the math." "It might," Sam said, "or it might not matter." "What do you mean?" Sam pulled out his journal and flipped to an entry he'd written that morning, after rereading everything he'd written in the past week. "The eviction isn't just about the missed rent." I looked at the notice again. "Vance is claiming I violated the lease by failing to maintain the property in habitable condition. He's blaming me for the damage." Greta's expression hardened. "That's standard practice for bad landlords," said a new voice. Sam turned. A woman had entered through the back door, tall, sharp-featured, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen 100 courtrooms. She wore no cut, no patches, just a wool coat and an expression that suggested she didn't suffer fools. "This is Diane Okafor," Greta said. "She's the lawyer I mentioned. Tenant rights, housing discrimination, veterans advocacy. She drove up from Minneapolis this morning." Diane shook Sam's hand and got straight to business. "I reviewed the documents Greta sent me. Your landlord is using a classic strategy. Blame the victim, muddy the waters, make the judge think the tenant is the problem. It works more often than it should. Can we fight it?" "We can, but I need to be honest with you." Diane set her briefcase on the kitchen table, the one room warm enough to work in, thanks to the generator humming outside. "Housing court favors landlords. Judges see 100 cases a month, and most of them don't have time to dig into the details. If Vance shows up with a lawyer and a paper trail, and you show up with photographs and a story about code violations, he wins. Then what's the point? The point is changing the narrative." Diane pulled a folder from her briefcase. "I've been doing some research on your landlord. Hank Vance owns 12 properties in this county. 8 of them have open code complaints. 3 have pending eviction cases. And last year, the county received a federal grant to address substandard veteran housing, a grant that was supposed to fund inspections and repairs on exactly the kind of properties Vance owns. What happened to it? Nothing. The money's sitting in an account, untouched. Someone on the county board has been blocking the program." Diane met his eyes. "If we can connect Vance to that obstruction, show that he's been profiting from the same conditions the grant was supposed to fix, this stops being a simple eviction case. It becomes a story about a system failing its veterans." Sam absorbed this. His head was starting to ache, the familiar pressure that meant his brain was working harder than it could sustain. He pulled out his journal and wrote quickly. "Diane Okafor, lawyer. Federal grant for veteran housing blocked." "Vance connected?" "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Your story. Your service record. Medical documentation of your injuries and how they've been affected by the living conditions here. Diane paused. And I need you to testify, not just submit paperwork. Stand up in front of the judge and tell him what you've been through. The room went quiet. Sam could feel everyone watching him, waiting. Testify. Stand up in public and lay out the wreckage of his life. The arm, the brain injury, the memory gaps, the nights he couldn't remember and the days he wished he could forget. Admit, out loud, that he'd been struggling to survive in a house that was slowly killing him. I'll do it, he said. Greta nodded once, something like pride in her expression. Good. Then let's get to work. They spent the rest of the day building the case. Sam dug through boxes he'd been avoiding for months, discharge papers, VA medical records, the folder of documents he'd kept from his service that he could barely stand to look at. Diane organized everything into a timeline. Eddie drafted an official assessment of the code violations. June uploaded the photographs to a shared drive. By evening, they had a file thick enough to matter. And then Sam's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway. On the other end, a woman's voice, official, clipped. Mr. Okonkwo, this is Judge Patricia Hendricks' clerk. I'm calling to inform you that your eviction hearing has been rescheduled. Sam's stomach dropped. Rescheduled to when? Monday morning, 9 a.m. The landlord's attorney filed a motion for expedited proceedings, citing ongoing property damage and safety concerns. The judge granted it. That's 3 days from now. Yes, sir. You'll receive formal notice by mail, but we wanted to ensure you were informed in time to prepare. The line went dead. Sam stood in his kitchen, the phone still pressed to his ear, the generator humming outside, the cold seeping in through the walls. 3 days. They'd had 11 days, and now they had 3. Greta was beside him before he realized she'd moved. What is it? The hearing. They moved it to Monday. Silence. Then Diane, her voice tight. Vance's lawyer. He must have seen us coming. Photographing the house, documenting violations. Someone tipped him off. Can we fight the motion? Not in time. Expedited hearings are almost impossible to challenge on short notice. Diane began packing her briefcase, her movements sharp with frustration. I'm sorry, Sam. I thought we had more time. Sam looked around the room, at the women who'd spent their Saturday crawling through his broken house, at the files they'd built, at the evidence that might not matter now. The ache in his head was a roar now, drowning out everything else. He thought about giving up. The thought was there, familiar, comfortable, the same thought that had kept him in bed on the worst days, that had whispered what's the point every time he tried to fight. He could let Vance win, find a shelter somewhere if they'd take him. Start over, again, with nothing. But then he looked at Greta, who'd stopped a stranger in a parking lot because she recognized the shape of someone drowning. At Eddie, who'd driven 40 miles on a Saturday to document the failures of a man he'd never met. At Diane, who'd left her practice in Minneapolis to fight a case she might not win. They hadn't given up on him. Maybe it was time he stopped giving up on himself. The county clerk, Sam said slowly. Deborah. She told me an emergency inspection could be expedited if there was documented evidence of immediate health hazards. Diane looked up. Eddie's assessment would qualify, but getting it processed before Monday, I'll go myself. First thing tomorrow morning. I'll wait at the office until they see me. Sam picked up his journal and wrote, Sunday, County Clerk, Emergency Inspection Request. Eddie's report. Even if you get the inspection approved, it won't happen before Monday, Diane said. Maybe not. But if the county acknowledges the request, puts it on record that an emergency inspection was warranted, that's evidence. Evidence that Vance has been renting an unsafe property. Evidence that the system knew and did nothing. Greta smiled, small and fierce. You're learning. I had good teachers. Sam closed his journal. Monday morning. What time should I be at the courthouse? 8. We'll be there. We? Greta glanced at the other Valkyries who'd gathered near the door. You didn't think we'd let you walk in there alone, did you? Sam looked at them, these women who owed him nothing, who'd shown up anyway, who'd built something from the wreckage of his silence. No, he said quietly. I guess I didn't. Outside, the Minnesota night pressed in. Somewhere, Hank Vance was preparing for a victory he thought was certain, but in a blue house on Cedar Street, a man who'd forgotten how to ask for help was learning something harder, how to accept it. The generator hummed. The space heater glowed, and Sam wrote one more line in his journal, pressing hard so the words would stay. Monday. Don't go alone. Sunday morning, Sam arrived at the county building before the doors opened. He sat in his truck with the engine running, the heat fighting the cold, his journal open on his lap. He'd written everything down the night before, every point Diane had made, every document Eddie had prepared, every step of the plan they'd built together. The words were there, in his own handwriting, proof that the past week had actually happened, and wasn't just another gap his brain had filled with noise. At 8:47 a.m., a woman in a county jacket unlocked the front doors. Sam recognized her. Deborah, the clerk who'd given him the complaint form. He got out of his truck, grabbed the folder Eddie had prepared, and walked toward the building. Mr. Okonkwo. Deborah looked surprised to see him. The office doesn't open until 9. I know. I'll wait. She studied him for a moment, the empty sleeve, the folder clutched in his right hand, the determination in his face. Then she held the door open. Come on, I'll make coffee. By 9:15, Sam had filed an emergency inspection request with Eddie's assessment attached. By 9:30, Deborah had walked it personally to the county housing coordinator, who'd looked at the photographs, read the list of violations, and stamped the request approved, urgent. The inspection won't happen until Tuesday at the earliest, she warned Sam. Maybe Wednesday. That's fine. I just need the paper trail. She gave him a copy of the approved request, date stamped and signed. Good luck tomorrow. Sam drove home through streets that were starting to feel less like a maze and more like a map. He knew where he was going, he knew why, and for the first time in months he trusted himself to remember. Monday morning broke clear and cold, the sky a hard blue that hurt to look at. Sam put on the only suit he still owned, a charcoal gray he'd worn to Ellen's funeral 3 years ago, when he'd still had a wife and 2 arms and a life that made sense. The jacket hung loose on his diminished frame. The left sleeve was pinned at the elbow, empty and obvious. He thought about the prosthetic, still sitting in his closet where he'd put it months ago. He could wear it, hide the absence, pretend he was whole. Instead, he left the sleeve empty and drove to the courthouse. The parking lot was full of motorcycles. Sam counted them as he pulled in. 18 bikes, chrome gleaming in the winter sun, arranged in a neat row near the courthouse steps. The Valkyries stood beside them in their leather cuts, breath fogging in the cold, faces set with the quiet intensity of soldiers before a mission. Greta was at the center, her hand-knitted scarf wrapped twice around her neck. She walked to meet him as he got out of his truck. You ready? No. He held up his journal. But I wrote it down so I won't forget. Inside, the courthouse smelled like old wood and bureaucracy. The hearing room was smaller than Sam expected, a judge's bench at the front, 2 tables for plaintiff and defendant, a few rows of wooden benches for spectators. Hank Vance was already seated at the plaintiff's table, with a lawyer in an expensive suit. He looked up when Sam entered, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, at the stream of women in motorcycle leather filing in behind. Diane was waiting at the defendant's table. She'd traded her wool coat for a blazer, her briefcase open, papers arranged with military precision. We've got about 10 minutes, she said quietly. The judge is Patricia Hendricks. She's fair but impatient. Don't ramble. Answer questions directly. And when I ask you to describe the conditions you've been living in, don't hold back. Sam nodded and took his seat. Behind him he could hear the benches filling, the Valkyries, but others too. Eddie Kowalski, Deborah from the county clerk's office, people he didn't recognize, men and women who'd heard about the case and showed up to watch. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Judge Hendricks entered. She was 60-ish, gray-haired, with reading glasses perched on her nose, and an expression that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. Vance versus Okonkwo, she announced. Eviction proceedings. Mr. Vance, your attorney may proceed. The lawyer stood, sleek, polished, clearly expensive. Your Honor, my client seeks immediate eviction of the defendant for non-payment of rent totaling $1,800 over 3 months, as well as significant property damage caused by the defendant's negligent. Your Honor, Diane rose smoothly. We'd like to enter into evidence documentation of substantial code violations on the property, violations that predate my client's tenancy and constitute a material breach of the implied warranty of habitability. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're claiming the property is uninhabitable? I'm claiming it should have been condemned. Diane handed a folder to the bailiff. This assessment was prepared by Edward Kowalski, retired county building inspector with 32 years of experience. It documents 11 code violations, including a furnace that has been leaking carbon monoxide since November, a porch with rotted structural supports, and an electrical panel with active fire hazards. Vance's lawyer sputtered. Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. My client has received no formal notice of any violations. Actually, he has. Diane produced another document. This is a complaint filed by Mr. Okonkwo with the county housing office 3 days ago, requesting an emergency inspection. The request was approved yesterday. The county has officially acknowledged that the property poses immediate health and safety risks. Judge Hendricks reviewed the documents, her expression unreadable. Mr. Vance, you've been collecting rent on this property for 18 months? Vance's lawyer answered for him. Your Honor, my client has made every reasonable effort to maintain. I asked Mr. Vance. Hank Vance looked like a man watching his last defense crumble. He stood slowly, hands flat on the table. Yes, Your Honor. And were you aware of these conditions? He glanced at his lawyer, who gave a small shake of his head. I knew there were some issues. The furnace, the porch. I've been meaning to address them, but the money... He stopped. It's complicated. It usually is. Judge Hendricks turned to Sam. Mr. Okonkwo, I'd like to hear from you directly. What has it been like living in this property? Sam stood. His heart was pounding, his head starting to ache, with the familiar pressure of his brain working too hard. He pulled out his journal and held it where he could see his notes. Your Honor, I served 2 tours in Iraq with the Army. An IED took my arm and gave me a traumatic brain injury that affects my memory. He paused, making sure the words were coming out right. When I moved into the house on Cedar Street, I thought I was getting a fresh start. Instead, I got a furnace that stopped working in November. I've been heating one room with space heaters ever since. The power got cut last week because I couldn't afford the electric bills. I've been living on a generator donated by people I met 10 days ago. He looked at Greta, then back at the judge. I didn't ask for help. I've never been good at that. But when I finally did, when I finally admitted I was drowning, these people showed up. They documented everything. They found a lawyer. They drove here on a Monday morning to sit in a courtroom because they believe veterans deserve better than to freeze in houses that should be condemned. He held up the journal. I have to write everything down because my brain doesn't hold on to things anymore. But I remember this. I remember that this country asked me to give everything I had, and I gave it. And I remember that when I came home broken, the system that was supposed to help me instead let a man collect rent on a death trap, while federal money meant to fix places like this sat untouched in a county account. The courtroom was silent. Sam sat down, his hand trembling slightly against the journal's cover. Judge Hendricks removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. Mr. Vance, is it true that your properties have received federal grant money intended for veteran housing improvements? Vance's lawyer started to object, but Vance himself spoke first. No, Your Honor. The grant money was never dispersed. It's been held up by... He stopped, something shifting in his face. By the county board, a member who owns competing properties. He's been blocking the program for 18 months. And you knew about this? I knew. Vance looked at Sam, really looked at him for the first time. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that I was just trying to survive, same as everyone else. But that man, he gestured at Sam, that man lost an arm for this country, and I've been taking his money while he froze. That's not survival. That's something else. He turned back to the judge. I'm withdrawing the eviction filing, and I'm waiving the back rent, all of it. Mr. Okonkwo can stay until the county gets its act together and fixes that house, or until he finds somewhere better. That's the least I owe him. The courtroom erupted. Vance's lawyer grabbed his arm, protesting, but Vance shook him off. Judge Hendricks banged her gavel for order. Mr. Vance, you understand that withdrawing this filing doesn't absolve you of responsibility for the conditions documented here. I'm referring this matter to the County Housing Authority for further investigation. I understand. And Mr. Okonkwo, the judge's voice softened, just slightly. I'm also going to recommend that the county expedite disbursement of the veteran housing grant funds, starting with the property at Cedar Street. Someone should have done that a long time ago. She banged the gavel once more. Case dismissed. Outside, the cold hit Sam like a wall, but he barely felt it. The Valkyries surrounded him, clapping his shoulder, shaking his hand, Greta pulling him into a hug that smelled like leather and the hand-knitted wool of her scarf. "You did good," she said. "You stood up." "I had help." He pulled the grocery receipt from his pocket, worn soft now, the ink fading, but her number still visible. "You wrote this down for me 10 days ago. I almost threw it away." "But you didn't." "No." He looked at the receipt, at the ordinary list of items that had started everything: milk, eggs, bread, soup. "I didn't." Diane approached, briefcase in hand. "The county investigation will take months. But Vance's testimony about the blocked grant money, that's going to open doors. Someone on that board is about to have a very bad year." "And Sam?" "Sam gets to stay in his house while it gets fixed. The VA has emergency housing assistance programs too. I'll make some calls, get the process started." She smiled, just slightly. "You're not going to freeze this winter?" Sam nodded, but his eyes had found Hank Vance, standing alone by his car at the edge of the parking lot. The landlord looked smaller somehow, diminished, a man who'd made a choice and was only now beginning to understand what it would cost him. Sam walked over. Vance looked up, wary. "If you're here to gloat—" "I'm not." Sam held out his hand, his only hand, the one that had to do the work of two. "I'm here to say thank you. You didn't have to do that." Vance stared at the hand for a long moment. Then he took it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did." They stood there in the cold, two men who'd both lost more than they'd meant to, finding something unexpected in the wreckage. Behind them, 18 motorcycles roared to life. The Valkyries were ready to ride. 6 months later, spring came to northern Minnesota like an apology for winter, slow, uncertain, but warm enough to believe in. Sam stood in the parking lot of Hanson's Foods with 3 bags at his feet, watching his breath disappear into air that no longer bit. The phantom pain was quiet today, a dull hum instead of a scream. He'd learned to read its moods like weather, to know which days would be hard and which would let him be. A motorcycle pulled into the space beside his truck. Greta swung off the bike and pulled her helmet free, her gray streaked braid falling loose across her shoulders. The hand-knitted scarf was gone, replaced by a lighter jacket, worn soft with road miles. "You need a hand?" she asked. The same words she'd said 6 months ago, the same half-smile. "I've got it." Sam bent down and hooked one bag over his wrist, grabbed the second with his fingers. "But you can carry the third if you're offering." She laughed, a sound he'd learned to recognize, to look forward to. "Progress." They loaded the bags into his truck together. The rust was still spreading along the wheel wells, but the engine ran clean now. Eddie had spent a weekend under the hood, replacing parts Sam couldn't afford with labor Sam couldn't repay. "Thursday meeting's at 6 this week," Greta said. "We moved it up so people can make the ride after." "The ride?" "Memorial Run, first one of the season. Diane organized it, raised money for the Veteran Housing Fund." Greta leaned against the tailgate, arms crossed. "You should come." Sam thought about it. 6 months ago, he would have said no, would have made an excuse about his knee, his head, his need to be alone. Now he pulled out his journal and wrote, "Thursday, 6 p.m., VA meeting, memorial ride after, say yes." "I'll be there," he said. The house on Cedar Street wasn't blue anymore. The county had sent a crew in March, part of the finally disbursed federal grant, and they'd replaced the siding along with the porch, the furnace, the water heater, and half the electrical system. The new paint was a pale yellow that caught the afternoon light, cheerful in a way the neighborhood hadn't seen in years. Sam parked in the driveway and carried his groceries inside. The kitchen was warm, the windows sealed tight against the breeze. He put away the soup, the bread, the peanut butter, the coffee that no longer tasted like regret because he'd finally let himself buy the good kind. On the counter, next to a stack of bills he could actually pay now, was a framed photograph. 6 men in desert camo, squinting against a sun that felt like another lifetime. Sam touched the frame lightly, a habit now, a small ritual of remembering. He still had bad days, days when the gaps swallowed hours, when he woke up not knowing where he was or why his arm was gone, days when the phantom pain roared so loud he couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but wait for it to pass. The TBI hadn't healed, it wouldn't, but he'd learned to build scaffolding around the broken places, the journal, the routines, the people who showed up when he forgot to ask. His phone buzzed. A text from Deborah at the county clerk's office. Bored. Meeting tonight. Alderman Perkins officially censured for blocking the grant program. Thought you'd want to know. Sam typed back, "Thanks for everything." "Thank yourself," she replied. "You're the one who showed up." He set the phone down and thought about Hank Vance. The landlord had sold 8 of his 12 properties in the months since the hearing, couldn't afford the repairs the county was now requiring, couldn't stomach the fines for conditions he'd ignored for years. The last Sam had heard, Vance had taken a job managing a hardware store in Duluth, trying to start over the way Sam had tried to start over, the way everyone tried when the life they'd built stopped working. Sam didn't hate him. That surprised him sometimes when he thought about the months of cold, the fear, the slow erosion of believing he deserved better. But hatred took energy he didn't have to spare, and Vance had made a choice in that courtroom, a choice that cost him everything, that probably saved Sam's life. That had to count for something. Thursday evening, Sam drove to the VA with his journal on the passenger seat. The support group had grown since February, 18 people now, veterans and family members and a few civilians who'd found their way to Greta's circle through paths Sam didn't ask about. He knew their names, their stories, the shape of their damage. He knew which ones needed silence and which ones needed to talk. He knew because he'd written it all down, and because some things the brain held on to even when it couldn't hold anything else. After the meeting, they rode. 32 motorcycles wound through streets that were finally thawing, past the courthouse where Sam had testified, past the blue now yellow house on Cedar Street, past Hanson's Foods where a grocery receipt had changed everything. Sam rode in Greta's sidecar. His balance wasn't good enough for his own bike, might never be, but the wind still found his face, and the rumble of engines still felt like something worth believing in. They ended at the VFW hall, where Diane had set up tables of food and a donation jar that was already overflowing. Eddie was there, and Deborah, and faces Sam recognized from the Thursday meetings and the courtroom and the long months of learning how to be part of something again. Greta found him standing near the back, watching the crowd. "You okay?" "Yeah." He pulled his journal from his pocket, a new one now, the old one filled cover to cover with the record of a life rebuilt. "Just trying to remember all of it. That's what the rest of us are for." She squeezed his shoulder. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Sam looked at her, this woman who'd stopped for a stranger in a parking lot, who'd seen him drowning and refused to look away. He thought about the receipt she'd given him, still folded in his wallet, the ink faded to ghosts, but the meaning clear as ever. Milk, eggs, bread, soup, the ordinary things that kept a life going. "I know," he said. "That's what I'm trying to remember." Outside, the Minnesota spring settled in, soft and uncertain and full of promise. And in a hall full of people who'd learned that asking for help was its own kind of courage, a man who'd lost an arm, and most of his memory found something he'd stopped believing existed, a place to belong. He wrote it down, just in case. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of ordinary courage. And tell us in the comments, who showed up for you when you needed it most?